My name is Owen Jones. I am the president and CEO of Tommy Docs. I'm also the 23-24 chair of the Greater Wausau Chamber of Commerce. I want to thank all of you for attending tonight's annual gathering. Tonight we convene to celebrate our 111th year as a Chamber of Commerce and to present an opportunity to bring membership and community together as we collectively work to build a vibrant and thriving Wausau. Before I go any further, I'd like to offer a huge thank you to tonight's sponsors who made this event possible. Marathon Cheese and North Central Technical College are our presenting sponsors. Our supporting sponsors, Aspirus Health, the Dirks Group, Reuter Ware, and Wisconsin River Partners. And finally, our venue sponsor, the beautiful Grand Theater. I've been a member of the Chamber's Board of Directors for several years. It's safe to say this past year has been as momentous as any. The organization celebrated its move to a new headquarters in the historic downtown train depot earlier this year. The Chamber once again offered its members a variety of networking and educational programs, strengthening the business community here in central Wisconsin. The Chamber has tackled the shared workforce challenges in our region head-on with programming tailored for those in human resources, by building tools which can connect those in education with those in industry, and by developing content which both educates and unites, which you'll see shortly in a new video debuting tonight. I have a great appreciation for what the organization stands for, along with its mission. What tonight's program will reinforce is the importance of building a strong community with strong businesses. Now more than ever, building special places is essential for the success of our community. I look forward to leading the Chamber's board in unity as we continue to focus the Chamber's effort on improving the future of our region, not just for our members, but for the community as a whole. Finally, I'd like to thank the members of the Executive Committee and the Board of Directors for their leadership, time, and dedication. Thank you also to Dave and the Chamber's staff, and a special thank you to the organization's large roster of volunteers who devote many hours of their time to help the Chamber and its membership succeed. Recognition of current board members: Dr. Darren Ackley, Gerard Klein, Heidi Fisher, Greg Fisher, Keith Hiltz, Laura Huggins, Lance Leonhard, Stephen Lipowski, Carrie Strobel, Kim Weber, Jeffrey Wicklander, Nicole Williams, and Sean Wright. Recognition of incoming board members: Thomas Myron, Chris Fender, Charlotte Skinner, Dennis Tan, and Ozalie Toms. And finally, recognition of outgoing board member Ted Fox. Pretty sure I got most of those names right, so I'll take the odds. Let's give them a round of applause. Trying to lighten it up. This time, I would like to introduce Dave Ekman, President and CEO of the Greater Wausau Chamber of Commerce.
Owen's done this before, no doubt.
Not with the vocal mic.
If you didn't know it, Owen's a professional drummer. Call him Sticks. So, Owen, thank you and the entire board of directors for your commitment to the organization and our community and our membership. Tonight I'd like to focus brief comments on a story of inspiration about a family overcoming adversity. This story came to me last week and it was a must share. In my role as president and CEO at the Chamber, coupled with decades-long involvement in workforce and economic development, I have the privilege and opportunity to serve on various boards. Last week, at the meeting of the North Central Wisconsin Workforce Development Board, a story of a family overcoming adversity was shared, and I'm going to share this story with you. Very important. It gets to the why we do what we do here and what the organization is doing. On December 20th, 2021, 16-year-old twins Juliana, Isaac, along with their 18-year-old sister, Adriana, faced an impossible decision that nobody should have to make. Their mother had been hospitalized with COVID-related illness. Medical professionals consulted the family and concluded that their mother's condition would not improve. As a family of teenagers made the difficult decision to remove their mother from life support and allow her to be at peace. The decision shattered their young hearts and left them alone without their loving mother. Next year, been harder as reality had set in, and yet their strength as a family, commitment, and love for one another kept them grounded. This commitment has helped them as they have started to take steps forward, opening themselves up to new opportunities and beginning to live life their mother wanted for them. Adriana, now 20, the big sister everybody would want to have. After her mother's passing, Adriana put aside her education to become a full-time caretaker for her younger siblings. Responsibility runs deep in her soul, and she knew the challenges her siblings would face entering their foundational years. She took it upon herself to ensure their experiences were that of every other developing teen in the Wausau area. Responsibility includes becoming a family chauffeur, managing expenses, and the all-around challenges of running a household. We all know this, the complexity of it, of an 18-year-old at that point. She ensured the family stayed in their home through it all. Adriana adapted her education schedule to align with the family commitments, ensuring the path to her dream job of becoming a dentist has a strong foundation. On June 10th of this year, Adriana graduated from the National Dental Academy as a certified dental assistant. She's on her pathway. She's building her foundation. Adriana, I am quite confident your mother's very proud of you. Isaac, one of the twins. Now Isaac, 17, embodying what it means to be a lumberjack. Isaac's now entering his senior year at Wausau East, and though he may be quiet and calm one of the family, he is a force to be reckoned with on the football field. Football is his priority in Isaac's life right now, and what comes with it are the practices, weightlifting, and team activities, and regretfully, Isaac is not with us here because he's at football practice right now. So, Brian, one thing that I'd like to follow up on is if we can get a to-go box and we can fill it with food and we can give it to the young ladies to take home for Isaac. So Isaac has a passion for food service, and he's inspired to be a chef, to go into a culinary program, and own a food truck. We need food trucks here. And this summer, Isaac took part in a 3-week culinary boot camp, learning new culinary skills, the art of food preparation, and networking within the field. Following the boot camp, Isaac was offered a paid work experience and now is a cook at Bunker's Grill. Another success. Today, Isaac's thriving in the culinary, on the field, and in the classroom, making his mother proud, I'm sure. And then Juliana, now 17, bringing color to her family and the community. Juliana, also entering her senior year, has a passion for cosmetology and is always trying new hair and nail styles, but truly brings the creative vibrancy to this family. While entering the career exploration phase, Juliana stepped into an opportunity to serve an organization that works to bring people downtown. And over the summer, Juliana engaged with the Wausau River District on a paid work experience. Juliana's sense of exploration has made her a vibrant light here in the downtown scene. Juliana, rest assured, your future will be just as bright here in downtown Wausau, and your mother would be proud of you. You know, when the Jasso family was at their most vulnerable moment, they embraced their sense of family first, and community. Working together to ensure their futures would carry on their mom's legacy. It's an unbelievable story of resiliency in the face of adversity, a testament to the human spirit. Ladies and gentlemen, help me recognize these two young ladies, Adriana and Juliana. You guys are incredible. You're the big sis everybody wants. So proud of you. So why share the story with you tonight? The story sets a foundation of the work we are all engaged in to build a thriving and vibrant community. It's about our greatest resource and asset, the people, our youth, the citizenry. It's about Adriana, Isaac, Juliana, and those that call the greater Wausau community home, our town, Wausau. It's about the people. Some years ago, my friend, mentor, and colleague Jim McIntyre was not able to make it here tonight. He introduced the book Our Towns to me and our team, and then to the community. And why? Why did Jim do that? Because Jim, as the first chairperson of the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partnership, the economic development leadership arm, was all in. If you ever ran into Jim, he would say, I'm all in. And when Jim wasn't all in, he would tell you he wasn't all in. And he was all in on this work. And he was all in to develop a thriving competitive community for 21st century Wausau in the knowledge economy. From an economic development perspective, Our Towns, of which we have the authors here tonight, has been a guidepost, a literary work that shares stories on community transformation of communities across the country. Tonight's Our Towns program is dedicated to Jim McIntyre for his committed leadership, over decades to enhance the economic vitality of the greater Wausau region. Folks, we're at a crossroads. Our next steps as a community are critical. If we are to build a competitive Wausau for next generations, these young ladies and our families, we must build a strong coalition, and it's the enlistment of community stakeholders. That's what we need to come out of this meeting tonight after we hear James and Deborah, is to enlist our community to move this wonderful Wausau, our town, forward. At this time, I've given you one why, and it's about these young ladies and those that are here in our youth, our next generation. At this time, I'd like to present the first chapter of the Tipping Point series, a 5-part contextual work that brings greater meaning to the why. Why this evening program and why the work we are doing is so critically important, and a collective work to move forward is critical to our success. So Brian, if you would, please.
Over the decades, the Wausau region's economic stability seemed to flow as naturally as the river that helped power its growth. From lumber to insurance to metal manufacturing, the core strength of the region has been its ability to transform itself. The result was a sense of security that somehow prosperity was predestined.
It was ubiquitous, both insurance and forest-related products. The two big things that kind of drove our economy, and it made a big impression on me as a young person. We were a community that was doing well.
Wausau Insurance opened their new facility in 1967. That was a boom time and a very optimistic time. And many other companies were thriving. Paper mills were always fairly stable, doing very, very well.
There was a lot of growth, there was a lot of home building. The schools were full because, it was the baby boomer kids like me. I graduated from high school in 1975, and it was just kind of common knowledge that if you were going to go on to school to get a degree or a technical degree, that you would then probably work for Wausau Insurance. And if you were not, you'd be at the mill.
It was a great place to go for the holidays and Christmas and gather around the Easter Bunny and get your kids' picture taken. There was just a wonderful energy to Wausau.
Just as boulders disrupt a river channel, obstacles emerged on Wausau's economic landscape that significantly altered the course of the region. Business success attracted the attention of out-of-town buyers. Seismic shifts in technology, global markets, and culture disrupted some industries and fueled others.
So the complexion of Wausau changed dramatically when Wausau Insurance evolved out of town.
Locally owned companies were purchased by larger organizations, so they didn't make their decisions here because we maybe sold to Joe and Mary at their shop, but now it was owned by a corporation in New York City.
It's real scary when a company announces that it's closing down. It's sold and then later, literally going away, which is what happened with Wausau Insurance. That's a big impact on the community.
In 1967, the Drott family sold the Drott Manufacturing Company to J.I. Case. Case poured enormous amounts of money into the plant that was built here. So it was just a steamroller for 20 years, building bigger things than anybody could ever imagine here. And by 1993, they were gone.
Still, Wausau's economy repeatedly has proven its ability to adapt. Successful homegrown businesses, such as the Greenheck Group, Wausau Coated Products, Aspirus, E.O. Johnson Technologies, and many others, represent an impressive core that have found ways to thrive in the face of rapidly changing economic conditions.
That's the success story of Wausau, reinventing itself. We had these new businesses from creative people, entrepreneurs who grew up in this area.
Who would have ever thought that a company like Merrill Steel would come in here and take over that plant and now be a premier steel supplier for the NFL and building their stadiums?
I mean, Wausau just seized opportunities and been in the right position, and they've always had hardworking people that were community-minded and then built the infrastructure and support systems to make it successful.
You look at the changing times and the way that people handled it, and even still today, but I think being adaptable is big, having community connections.
Wausau's business community is rightfully proud of its economic heritage, but that century-long stream of success and stability may be coming to an end as the region faces its most difficult challenge yet, the national labor shortage.
We're at a tipping point. We're going to be a winner in this effort or not.
It didn't happen overnight for Wausau Insurance and Wausau Papers and East Bay to develop into the kind of companies that they were, employing thousands of people in our community. It took decades, and to replace them is going to take years and years.
I'm not an alarmist, but if we don't grow, we have an existential crisis on our hands. We need to keep growing. If we want to continue living this wonderful life, we need more people to come here and live it with us.
Our world is changing, and it's changing so fast. And if we're not aware of that, we could lose a lot of what we've built.
And that's our challenge. There's more videos to come, and they'll be released once every week subsequent here after tonight. So having read Our Towns, watching the HBO documentary, I watched it 3 times, and now having spent time with the past few days with James and Deborah, I've had the opportunity to get to know them personally a bit better, discuss their work of our towns, and then showing them our town today. The Chamber of Commerce, we get about 5 days a year where we call it chamber weather, and one of those days was today. And we use the other one at the golf outing when we can. So this evening, we have an opportunity to learn from the Fallows and their celebrated work in the country. The quick introduction. James Fallows has been a national correspondent for The Atlantic for more than 35 years, reporting from China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Europe, and across the United States. He's the author of 11 previous books. His work has also appeared in many other magazines and as a public radio commentaries since the 1980s. He's won National Book Award and a National Magazine Award, and for 2 years, an interesting fact here, for 2 years he was President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter. Deborah Fallows is a linguist and writer who holds a PhD in theoretical linguistics and is the author of 2 previous books. She has written for The Atlantic, National Geographic, Slate, The New York Times, and The Washington Monthly, and has worked at the Pew Research Center, Oxygen Media, and Georgetown University. She and her husband have 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. With that, we're going to show you one more before we bring James and Deborah up. If you would please roll the trailer.
5 years ago, we asked people to tell us the story of your town. We've been traveling and reporting.
We thought there must be something going on in America. People wanted to talk about their town.
What we saw, how towns rise and fall, has a lot to say to our world right now.
This was a depressed timber town.
Bend was really grasping for what was going to be next.
The past is the past, and Mississippi is striving for change.
We need to replace judgment with compassion, and we need to replace punishment with treatment.
We're a safe haven. We feed the kids. They think, oh, this is just a boxing gym. That's far from the truth. We are fixing what needs to be fixed around here.
Almost every place we went, people said, the U.S. is really in horrible shape. But here, things are really moving ahead. What's your secret?
We all come together.
If it can happen here in the poorest of all states, then the positive things are replicable elsewhere.
The story of my town is the American story of this era.
So everybody, help me welcome James and Deborah Fallows.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just so you can keep us straight, I am Jim, and this is Deb. So, is there something you'd like to say to begin?
Oh, I would like to thank Dave for that great introduction, and I just want to make one tiny correction. We now have 6 grandchildren. It happened, it happened so fast. Thank you.
And this will be a little clue to regional Americana. So we have 2 sons. One of our sons and his family live in Dallas, Texas, and their 2 children are named Jack and Eleanor. Our other son lives in Santa Barbara, California, and their 4 children are named Tide, Navy, West, and Tiger. So I am from California, so I can give this report. So Deb, do you want to?
No, I will take a seat.
Okay, Deb will take a seat, and I'm going to tell you the sort of the tag team act we're going to do here. So thank you very much, David, for all of your gracious introduction to us and to Owen and to the wonderful story of Adriana and Isaac and Juliana, who really are the hope for Wausau and the country and the world. So we are touched to be part of this. We're so glad to be here in Wausau for the last while. We're grateful to Jim McIntyre, in whose in whose honor this event is happening. We've seen all 5 episodes of The Tipping Point. We had a kind of preview before coming here, so stay tuned for the next one. They're unveiling week by week, like some Showtime or HBO serial, but you'll find them worthwhile. Deb and I have been here only a little more than 24 hours. We got here yesterday afternoon from DC. It feels as if it has been many days worth of immersion, just these past 24 hours of meeting people, seeing things in this typically beautiful central Wisconsin weather in the fall, which we're very happy to enjoy. And the most valuable initial impression we've had is the one that as a town most wants to leave on visitors, that they would love to come back and spend more time, meet more people, get to know more about the community. And we have many people to thank. I won't enumerate them all now. I will say that Deb, who is originally from the Midwest, as she will tell you, finds the hospitality here typical of Midwestern people. She's always telling me that Midwestern people are nice. I, having grown up on the fringes of the Mojave Desert in California, am impressed by the greenery and the water and all the other lushness of this setting. And I'm going to tell you the plan for the way we'll spend the next, we're honored to spend this next while with you. You know, sometimes when you see a PowerPoint presentation and you look at the numbers at the bottom of the slide, you see this is slide number 3 out of 400. You think, oh no. And it's much better when it's slide number 3 out of 26 or something. So this is presentation number 1 of a total of 3. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the path that has brought us to Wausau over the past 10 years. Some of the larger patterns we've seen around the country when making our film and before and after that, and the way we think about those, how they match onto the challenges and the progress that you're making here in this part of Wisconsin. So I will do that for an initial setup. Then part 2 is going to be Deb talking about some particular ways things we've seen in communities around the country seem to apply to particular ambitions that you all are having in the region. So she will then tell you about that. And then I will come back for a segment we think of as 24 hours in Wausau. The point of the reporting life, the journalistic life, which is basically the only thing I've done since getting out of college, is the things you didn't know until you showed up. That's what reporting is about. Showing up is 99% of the job. And we've been thinking about your ambitions, your plans, your prospects for a long time, since first contemplating coming here. We've only shown up in the past day. And so there are certain things which have struck us mainly in positive ways, sometimes in challenging ways, so we'll try to say, this is what new visitors to your city and region who've been thinking about it for a long time have to offer, and what we'll hope to see when we come back again. So that is the plan. So, and one other thing I'll say, which resonates with our film, which is available on HBO, and I'll say the most touching thing that happened after our film was produced was that the U.S. State Department commissioned it to be shown in American embassies around the world as sort of a portrait of this is the part of America you're not hearing in the news about all the other churn and turmoil of America that are going on. So now let me give you the setup of what brought us to Wausau from a path that began 10 years ago. I say 10 years. Deb, I should probably call you up again for this part of just for a little cameo role. So Deb and I met 55 years ago on a blind date in college when we were both 18 years old. We've been together since then. We got married when we were 21 and have been all around the world in various incarnations. And you may sit down now. Right. Okay. You've seen the rare moment of me giving the instructions. And in those 5.5 decades together, we think of it mainly as sort of, there is a kind of decade by decade pattern. The 1970s, before many of you were born, was a time when we were starting our family, starting our married life. It was a time of politics and journalism. As you heard from David, we were in Washington then because I was working for Jimmy Carter as his speechwriter in the White House. This was Jimmy Carter, by the way, his 99th birthday is 9 days, it's 10 days from today. It's October 1st is his 99th birthday. I remember clearly the birthday we celebrated on the campaign trail 1 month before his election as president, when he turned 52, just before he was elected president. He was then a relatively young president. Those of us on his staff who were mainly in our early 20s thought, this guy is so old. And now he is indeed, the oldest, by far the oldest living ex-president. It was a decade of politics and journalism. In the 1980s, it was mainly a decade of Japan and Southeast Asia. We lived there for a number of years reporting. Our children were little. They went to Japanese public school. They traveled around Malaysia. And that was a very important part in our family life. In the 1990s, we think of that as the decade of technology. Deb, with her background as a linguist, worked in Seattle for an early search engine company, trying to think of what is this thing as search engines. Tragically, it was not Google, but it was a great adventure. I was doing a number of tech jobs there. Including, if any of you ever, I'll save my story about Microsoft Word for later on. The 2000s were, for us, the decade of China. We lived in China for a number of years, wrote about it. Deb wrote a wonderful book called Dreaming in Chinese, What You Learn About China by Learning Chinese Language. It's a very popular book. It's a short book. The publisher is called the Short Books Company, so they live up to their reputation. But for us, the past decade, the 2010s coming into the 2020s, was for us the years of America. Because when we came back to the U.S. from China a little more than 10 years ago, we had been seeing the U.S. from a distance and mainly hearing about all the sources of travail and polarization and strife. And so we thought that it would be time to try to re-examine our own country in the way that we've been trying to understand China by going to smaller cities and remote parts of the country. And so 10 years ago, Deb and I, both being from smaller town America, Deb grew up mainly in Vermilion, Ohio, on the shores of Lake Erie. I grew up mainly in Redlands, California, in inland California, an orange growing town. We thought it would be worth trying, in the little propeller plane you saw, to go around to different parts of the country and ask them not, what do you think about the next senatorial election? What do you think about the next presidential election? But what is the story of this town? Who is moving here? Who is moving away? What are the young people like? What are their older people like? What is the source of hope for the town? What's the identity? What are the challenges? Things where we just were trying to understand the entirety of America as a real place. The reason I put it that way is the tendency of media, as you know, is to present New York City as a real place, and Los Angeles as a weird but real place, and DC as a controversial but real place, with all the kind of complexities we're aware of. I've never lived in New York City, but I feel as if I know every block of it just from movies and news reports and all the rest. And by the same tendency, the rest of America is often portrayed as sort of a two-dimensional or one-dimensional place that you hear about in the news only when there's a tornado or something else that has gone wrong, or the Iowa caucuses or whatever, but not real places where people are having their full three-dimensional life. So that was the project we began 10 years ago, going first to Holland, Michigan, where we had some friends. I know some of you have been to Holland, and Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and traveling around. And in various ways, we spent a lot of the next 4+ years just on the road, going to towns all around the country. We described them in our book. And the criteria we were using, they started out being simply, what is a place that you wouldn't hear about in the news unless there were an emergency, and trying to treat it as a real place rather than just a source of some spectacle. And then we tried to fill in the landscape. As time went on and we had some positive news to report, we started going to more and more troubled places. We spent a lot of time in Mississippi, and a lot of time in West Virginia, and in the town of San Bernardino, adjoining my hometown, and seeing places with more dramatic challenges and trying to understand them too. We did hundreds of web posts for this. We wrote our book and then made this movie, which came out 2 years ago. And the point I'm getting to, which brings us to Wausau, is that we had a sort of a series of discoveries or revelations about what smaller towns, smaller communities in America were challenged by and responding with to the economic and political and environmental and other challenges that they faced. The first level of our discovery in the first few months on the road was simply how much was going on in how many places in the country that you wouldn't know about unless you were there. I mean, for example, we spent an extended time in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which of course is a large city in the plains, kind of the capital of the Upper Plains. But we hadn't realized until we went there how important a refugee community was there, of how a place that you think of as having ethnic diversity mainly between Scandinavians and Germans was having a very large refugee community and the way they were adapting their life there. Or, for example, any image you've ever seen on Google Maps or Google Photos has been delivered from satellites to the Earth to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And that's where they're stored in a federal facility north of there. And the theme of our initial reports was simply, you won't believe what's going on in city X, Y, and Z, because it was so exciting and so dramatic. We then, as time went on, were struck by how much more promising and possible American prospects seemed on the city-by-city level than they did if you were just following national politics and gridlock and government shutdowns and everything else. That the old idea of laboratories of democracy still seemed to be the case at much of the state level and many of the local levels, and that mayors were getting things done, mayors and chambers of commerce and community foundations and all the rest. And we had a wonderful moment when we were able to unite the mayors of two opposite seeming cities and have them realize how much they had in common. One is the city of Greenville, South Carolina, very conservative. Trey Gowdy was the congressman there. Before him, Jim DeMint. It's a very reliably Republican city. Burlington, Vermont, Bernie Sanders had been its mayor. And the two political parties always that contest for power in the Burlington city elections are the Democrats and the Socialists. Those are the two parties on the ballot. But we had the mayors of these two cities recognize that they were essentially the same city. They had similar challenges, similar opportunities, similar issues with youth, et cetera. So we began spreading this message in articles and books. And we began, after a while of doing this, to concentrate on the patterns. What are the ingredients that, for all of the regional differences and the uniqueness of each community, the things that are very different in Charleston, West Virginia, from Fresno, California, and from Columbus, Mississippi, from Bend, Oregon, the things that really you could say there are common themes. There are similarities despite the differences. One of them that Deb has talked about to great effect is how any successful city will have a river walk whether or not it has a river. And you all are in the fortunate situation of having them both in the same place. And we saw the ways that successful cities were making creative uses of community colleges and technical institutes and four-year institutions, and that the colleges were reconfiguring their responsibility to the town. We saw how many successful communities were paying attention to, quote, real downtowns, unquote. That if the pattern of American settlement in sort of the post-World War II era was the sprawl suburb and big shopping malls, that the classic downtown was becoming a marker of a city that was really having an identity. We saw that they had, there's a whole list we had in the end of our book of signs of civic success, of
local patriots and believing in public-private partnerships and having brew pubs, which is really a marker of things going on the right way. And so we tried more and more to say something is happening and you can see what its ingredients are. You can try to learn from them and allow for all the differences and the peculiarities of each town's particular history, and then say, here's how we can apply the lessons of Fresno or Burlington or Sandusky, Ohio, or Brownsville, Texas, in different environments and try to learn from them. So that was what brought us up to the time of making this movie and trying to connect people having these challenges and opportunities around the country. And then things changed in a number of ways. There was a pandemic. There were political tensions of an unusual level in the United States. And we have had occasion in the last 2 or 3 years, in a sort of practical way, we finished filming our movie with the HBO crew just before the pandemic lockdowns. And then during the first pandemic year, we were doing the post-production of recording the narration and the editing of all of that. And since then, we've begun visiting cities again. And we've tried to think about now, as we look at the wave of local level renewal and resilience and partnership and optimism in many cities, how is it different now? After political turmoil of an unusual degree, after the pandemic, and all the other changes you're well familiar with. And this is going to be sort of setting up Deb next. We have thought that that number one, it's the case that these changes of the past couple of years have accelerated transformations that were already underway, especially in the crucial value of how communities attract new people and young people to live there. What I mean by that is it had already struck us before the pandemic that really successful communities, they were attracting new businesses and new people, not so much by saying we're going to reduce the tax rate by 1 penny, in this level, we're going to give you this or that tax incentive but instead by saying, here is a place where you're going to want to raise your children. Here's a place where you're going to feel that your life is better. Here's a place where you might want to come back to when you were older, et cetera, et cetera. And that shift had already begun before the pandemic, that civic vitality was not simply about the most mundane dollar and cents things, but about more of the spirit of towns, of what made people think, this is where I want to be, this is where I want my children to be, this is where I want to be proud that I am from. And I now think that we are living through, and you in Wausau are charting your future about another of the great historic changes in American population and American settlement. And I'll just make this point, and then I'll give you Deb. If you, I won't give you Deb, I'll introduce Deb. If you look back at how people decided where to live in different stages of American history, you can see these big moments of dislocation. In the 1880s, of course, there was widespread immigration from Europe, mainly from Eastern Europe. Immigrants poured into the upper Midwest and the East Coast cities, and a lot of the settlement patterns and ethnic patterns of the Midwest and Northeast came from the 1880s. In the 1910s, not as sort of the rise of Jim Crow in the South, that's when the great black migration from Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia to Detroit and Chicago was underway, just before World War I, and all the patterns that flowed from that. During the Depression, of course, people moved. That was the great Dust Bowl migration, people coming from the Plain States to the West and elsewhere. After World War II, of course, there was the GI Bill and the suburbanization of the U.S. In the 1980s, 1990s, the pressures on manufacturing from globalization and the introduction of China also changed settlement patterns. And we're in another one of those right now. Right at this moment, people are deciding, young people beginning their careers, people in the middle of their careers, older people thinking where they want to spend their following years are thinking, where do I really want to be? Do I want to spend an hour in the car each morning going to work or coming back? Where can my children have an easier life? And the sense of, I think people will look back on this moment we are living through right now as another one of those moments in American history where all the settlement patterns change. And it's not that the big cities are going away, and it's not that tiny villages will suddenly quadruple in population, but there's going to be a different pattern on the land right now because of the decisions like what you all are making with your plans for Wausau. Deb now is going to talk about some of those decisions of how people decide where they want to be, what communities can do to make themselves more attractive, and what the concept of placemaking in a sort of soft power way means. So I give you Dr. Deborah Fallows.
Thank you, Jim. I can't tell you how happy we are to be here. I feel really at home, probably more than Jim because of where I grew up. But I was born in Chicago and lived the first 7 years in Minneapolis. So we would go back and forth to visit relatives and so forth. I had a lot of relatives who lived in Rice Lake, and I had other relatives, even older, who lived in Lake Geneva. For reasons I don't quite understand, when I was about 5 and my parents decided to go to New York and leave my sister, my older sister and me with great Aunt Agnes and great Uncle Joe in Lake Geneva for about 2 weeks. So this was the mid-1950s. This is the Lake Geneva I know. I hear it's changed a bit. But at Agnes and Joe's house, it was a little cottage that was built up on stilts. And my sister and I would sneak out in the mornings and meet up with these cute boys we met from Chicago. And we would go out to the dock on the lake and fish for walleye. And then we would come home, and have our typical old-fashioned day in this little house with old aunt and uncle. And on Sunday nights, we would all watch Lawrence Welk. I mean, I don't know if this resonates with any of you, but this is my memory of Lake Geneva, which I understand is a little more she now than is my memory. But so this is my early duckling imprint, and it's very strong. And as soon as we landed, I smell the air, I feel the breeze. It just looks so familiar. So thank you for being here and for inviting us here. I wanted to talk tonight about two things, kind of in detailed things, examples of things we've seen in two topics. One is about young people in your town, what it means to your town now and what it means to your town in the future. And I know that this is a hot topic, not only in Wausau, but it is the #1 topic in so many small towns that we have been to. The other is the idea of what's called in the kind of community development jargon of placemaking, which simply means you recognize and find your natural assets in the town and then see what you should do to appreciate those, use those, and build on those. So we've seen a lot about placemaking efforts around the country, and I want to tell you some specific examples that I think might either resonate with you or inspire you, because each town is unique, and each town we've seen, while Jim's talk about the trends, that's true, but it's also true that every one of the small towns depends on its own assets, its own people, its own place, and its own dreams. But first, I want to talk about the young people in town, and I mean the people. Like, how do you get them to stay in this town? If it's the young people, you want them to stay. If it's those who you want to lure back after they've grown up here and then gone away, or if it's the people from the outside who you want to persuade, convince, this is a pretty great place to be. So how does that whole happen? I want to take a step back from what we've seen that's even earlier than focusing on the young people in their 20s and 30s. And this is, what about the very little kids? We've seen some really interesting ideas about how you get the littlest people in your town to feel like they are really part of what's going on in this community, and they get to know it, they have a sense of ownership about it, and they like it. In Jim's hometown of Redlands, there's a really interesting program that is sponsored by the public library and the public schools together. Every single fourth grader in that town goes on what's called the Redlands Heritage Tour. And that means they have this whole section of their fourth grade curriculum where they pile the kids onto the buses and they take them along from stop to stop in the town. This is where the first orange grove was. This is the home of one of the earliest settlers. Here is the library that was donated to the town by the Smiley brothers, who incidentally look like those Smith Brothers cough drop guys with the big beards. I guess we don't have Smith Brothers cough drops anymore, but they look just like that. They donated the library, and their good friend Andrew Carnegie came to help them dedicate it. So when the kids go around on these tours and spot these places, they really get a sense of where they are from. And when they go home, I've heard from all their parents, and driving around the town, they'll tell them, they will instruct their parents, here's the Smiley Library, here's where Mrs. Kimberly, of Kimberly Crest and Kimberly Paper Products, who were, there was a big migration of people from the East Coast out to Southern California to spend their winters there, where she had her first home. They become the little ambassadors for the town in a way, and it's a really successful, beloved program. When we were hearing about, there's so much in this town. I don't know if you have a similar kind of heritage tour for the little kids, but you've got these Frank Lloyd Wright houses, as I understand. You've got the big houses from the people who came here first. You've got, I don't know exactly what is left of the lumber mills and some of the early manufacturing, but to show that to the little kids really gets them a sense of, this is my town, this is where I live. Another set of things we've seen are arming children with cameras or microphones or pencils and paper, and having them record for the towns their impressions. In the whole state of Delaware, there was a movement where they gave all the little kids disposable cameras. Go out, take a picture of something that strikes you as interesting, and then write a little story about it and bring it back. It was, of course, a contest, which who doesn't love a contest? Kids do, and some won. So there would be really touching pictures. The one I remember most was a little girl who took a picture of a single daisy breaking its way through the concrete, the cracks in the concrete. And she was writing a story. She took a picture of that daisy in the concrete and was writing a little story of, my life is kind of hard here in downtown Wilmington, but when I see that flower growing in the concrete, I know I can be that strong. You get these really heartfelt stories from the kids. They do the same things with podcasts now, telling the stories of their towns. And last week in Washington, D.C., I always get these newsletters from the public library. They have a contest going on that is a twist on this, where they have categories of photography, visual art, music, a couple other things. And the assignment, which is for the contest, is to focus on a civic topic that is happening in our town. Show it in your artistic expression and tell us what it means to you. So you can imagine in DC there are a lot of racial issues that are important and fraught in our town. There is violence. There are issues with the schools. There are a lot of great issues too, but to get young kids engaged in those issues and explain through their eyes what's happening and put them at the center of a civic responsibility is something that works is working really well in our town. One other example we saw in Bellevue, Iowa, where there is a requirement in the school system that kids have, they have to clear part of their schedules to work in civic-oriented projects. And we saw one of these, which was just amazing. It was a DIY building. It was an old button factory. And the kids said, we would like to turn this into a youth center because we don't have one. So their civic project was from soup to nuts, from the very idea that they wanted to take this old abandoned button factory and make it into a DIY place with all kinds of skills that they were applying. We saw this kind of midstream through what they were doing. In the basement, they of course wanted to make a recording studio so that they could have a radio station or record their music or do whatever they wanted to do with music. So the people, the adults in the town said, you know, it's a big deal, but okay, we will help you do this. And those kids were in the basement. They had done everything. They were putting up walls and putting in carpet and putting in soundproofing, everything by themselves, by hand, under the guidance of some teachers and other people who knew what they were doing. But this was their position in the community of what they were going to do. And it seems to be, you know, a really successful approach of give them voice, give them opportunity, listen to them, and just ask them. There was one study I was reading from about 5 years ago where kids were asked of, you know, do you ever do anything for your town? Are you ever asked to do that? And only 15% of them said, yeah, we do that. And then there was another question, would you do something if you were asked? And 70% of them said, absolutely, just ask me and I'll be part of it. So that power of just saying, hey, you kids, come on, you know, join us here. And in some other towns, there was an interesting kind of further push the door open to the kids effort, which was, you know, you don't always go to the student council leaders or the kids in the honor society and say, won't you be on the school board for us? Or won't you be a student rep on the city council? They tried to go deeper than that, where if there were tough issues in the town that they were talking about, like homelessness or juvenile crime, they would seek out kids who were living in homeless shelters or who were part of the juvenile disciplinary system and say, we want these kids to come and talk to us about these issues in the town from their perspective, which you know, brought in a completely different group of kids who would normally be part of this process. Moving on to the older generation, which is what we usually talk about in terms of youth, there's an easy part and there's a hard part. The easy part maybe is luring the young people who grew up here back here. They know, they have reasons to want to come back. And we've seen it already in Wausau, so many of the impressive young people you have who grew up here and have seen the effect of the nurturing of this community to know kind of how to help them and how to help them along and urge them along to be the entrepreneurs or to take the leadership roles. And I know you have a leadership training group here that helps those young people learn how to be leaders. Those have been so successful in the towns that we've seen. We've seen a lot of them, right, Jim? Right, yes. And hearing from the young people, you know, the kind of bonding experience and networking experience so that when they do grow into those positions of leadership, they know who to talk to. They know who's going to work with them. And it's like, you know, being in the same class in school. They're their buddies, except that they also have been learning these tremendous skills that are going to translate to the communities. Luring the people from far away is more of a challenge. You get the random cases. We saw a random case in South Dakota and a lot more random cases that happened during the pandemic, and I bet you've had a lot here too. There was DeSmet, South Dakota, home of Laura Ingalls Wilder. We spent a lot of time in this little town. There was a family who moved from Baltimore, Maryland in the middle of the pandemic with their 4 beautiful school-age daughters to DeSmet, Iowa. Population, DeSmet, South Dakota, population 1,500? At most. I mean, it was this big. So it was a big deal when these 4 beautiful girls moved to town. They went there because, for some of these same reasons. They wanted a safer place where their kids could roam around town, be part of a community, get out of Baltimore. And they loved Laura Ingalls Wilder. They'd been there on a tour when the girls were littler, and it just stuck with them, and they thought, okay, of all the places in the country to get out of Baltimore, let's go to DeSmet, home of Laura Ingalls Wilder. So they did, and they were, settled. That's very random, but they were settling in like a dream. And it, the randomness of things like that happening, it is one way to get people there, but there are also a lot better, more deliberate ways to do it, and it is quite clear that you all have figured out a lot of this too. I spent a year on Zooms with the development group in South Dakota. It's called Dakota Resources. Every week for a whole year, there were Zoom meetings of a whole lot of people from small communities in South Dakota talking about just this phenomenon, among other things. What do we need to do to make our town more attractive for the young families who want to come here, or those who might want to come here? And the lists were they were both big and little things. Broadband, if we're going to get entrepreneurs coming to this town, if we're going to get people from the cities, they'll expect broadband. We need broadband. A coffee shop, okay, this was more problematic. We've already got a coffee shop, but somebody wants to come with another coffee shop. How do we navigate the sensitivity of we've got one, is this competition, or is this good or bad competition? There were the questions of where are they going to live? And in a lot of the South, you all, again, have great plans for building new housing here. In some of these little South Dakota towns without the resources to do that, people were selling their houses at phenomenal prices, and then realizing they're going to have to live, in a they didn't know where they were going to live, because it was a great idea to sell your house, but then what are you going to do? Because you have to have a place to live too. Beyond this idea of how you attract people, we've seen a number of towns. Well, West Virginia has a program, maybe you've heard of it, Ascend West Virginia, where they actually will pay people who will work remotely or bring their businesses to West Virginia, where they hadn't been before, pay them $10,000 or $20,000 a year if they agree to live there. So you actually pay people to be imported. And for West Virginia, it really is something that seems to be working. I know that you're a big arts community. We've seen so many different kinds of efforts where the arts are the core and the heart of the community, both for the residents who are there and for those who are maybe going to consider living there. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, the George Kaiser Foundation has sponsored a whole group of artists in residence to come and live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, $150,000 for 3 years, complete with this old renovated building in downtown, which is Studio Artworks. And it's the idea of building this community of creative people who will commit to being in their town, make it a wonderful place for the residents, broaden it for the residents who live there, but also make it, open the eyes of the world to what it means to be in Tulsa through the artwork of all of these people who are living there. And we've seen this on a more modest scale in Eastport, Maine, where has been an artist in residence program for, certainly for the 10 years we've been following it. 3 or 4 artists in residence will live in these modest apartments and have along the tiny main street of this 1,400 people town, Eastport, Maine. The studio is open door to anybody who walks by, and the artists who are there for that time, interpreting Eastport from their point of view. It's been a tremendously successful operation of both helping, giving people who live in Eastport the opportunity to see what they see every day through the eyes of someone else and who can express it in some kind of artistic form. And it's also become a part of the town's identity. We are an art town now, and it has spawned galleries, and then it has spawned coffee shops because people who come to look at the galleries want coffee, and on and on. It's the snowball effect of that happening. So in each town, it's kind of a different version depending on the resources or the positioning of the town. And now I want to just talk just for a few minutes about something that is in the jargon. Again, it's called placemaking. You know what you have here. It's fantastic. You've got that ski hill, you've got all the water, you've got the river, you've got the river walks, you've got these beautiful buildings, you've got the farmland. You've got so much here that you have or are in the process of developing. There's another aspect of it that is not as measurable and countable, but I think is equally important, and it's the soft side of placemaking, of showing the public places in the town that somehow give a sense of humanity to the town. You say, well, what is this soft side of placemaking? It's like a change in attitude toward how people think of their town. There are 2 towns in particular where we saw this soft power of placemaking. One is in Winters, California. It's an agricultural town of about 10,000 people, about 60 miles east of San Francisco at the top of the Central Valley. And if we heard it once from young people in that town, I bet we heard it 10 times. And they said, you learn, one pair of a young couple who would live in the town said, you learn pretty quickly when you marry someone from Winters, you're going to end up in Winters. It's just a feeling that they have. You know it when you see it. In Eastport, Maine, which is, I know it's cold here, it's even colder there. And it's a brutal place if you're a fisherman, but people often say to them, how can you live here in the winter? And the answer is, how can you not live here? Because there's such a feeling about that town, that soft affiliation that you have with the town. And we're trying to figure out, how do you build that kind of attitude of, you know it when you see it, you just love this town. There are a couple things, and one that I have noticed from my background in languages and linguistics is how people talk about their town. Eastport, Maine is a really curious example. They have a little newspaper there, and they have a very active citizenry. And there was a group of women who said, no matter what good story is written in this newspaper about the town, it always ends with a little aside, a little few sentences at the end that uses the D words, DE words, words like decline, deny, despair, demoralize. We have a whole bunch of great new buildings, but you can't deny that there are also depressed looking buildings. And what is going on that you're talking about the positive things in the town, and then you ended on this flat note of the D words. Let's change that to the re words. Let's make it renew, reform, restore, replace, resilient, revitalize, reaffirm, respect. So they talked to the newspaper folks who, believe it or not, agreed, okay, we'll just kind of sneak in a few re-words at the end of these stories. Like, we will reactivate our affirmation for this town, or this shows how resilient we are, rather than, yeah, you got to look at the other side, we're a little bit depressed. That has really kind of stuck as a way of the town talking about itself. Fresno Fresno, California, which has its challenges, and we're meeting a lot of negativity, they got out there and said, you know what? We're going to rebrand this town, Fresno, into Frez Yes. So they have big banners, and it's Frez Yes with an exclamation point. I started thinking about this when I learned that the name of Wausau in Ojibwe, Chippewa, actually means faraway place. Now, I'm not a marketing person, I'm not a branding person, but it seems to me like here, we've heard it from you. Here you are in the middle of everything. You're in the middle of your state. You're midway between Chicago and Minneapolis. You're close to Green Bay. You're close to Madison and Milwaukee. You're right there in the middle of everything. There's got to be some way to talk about the faraway place in the middle of everything. So I'm just going to throw that out there as a language challenge that you might be able to use. A final thing, because using the public spaces, I'm a huge advocate for public libraries. And it's a place of trust. It's a place where so many opportunities go on for people to mix and mingle. You see people there that you don't normally see in your everyday life. You see homeless people. You talk about difficult issues. This is not part of my everyday life, but when I'm in a library, this is what I see. People I am not normally running into. So I think these public spaces in town, public places really give an opportunity to see the fullness of your town. Same thing with the YMCA. And I'll tell you, this afternoon I went down, I'm a swimmer, so I went to your Y. And the first thing that happened, I went in to swim and I was in the locker room kind of fumbling around. This woman said, "Your first time, right?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "You're gonna love it." And I thought, okay, this is the soft power of this place where I can run into anyone and they're gonna tell me, I'm gonna love it here in this YMCA in Wausau. I can't measure that, but I will always remember that. So I think these kinds of public places really give you a sense of the fullness of what happens. And Jim already told you about the river walks. Same thing. On our river walk in DC, I hear much more, I hear English, but I hear just as much French, German, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, Ukrainian, and I think this is a representation of my town that I'm not going to see if I just stay at home, but if I'm on that river walk, I will hear it and I will appreciate that as part of my town, which I know that you all are going to do too. So, Jim, yeah. Thank you.
So thank you, Deb. And this is, so just to mark your place in the 500 slides of the PowerPoint, we're near the end. I'm just going to do a little wrap up on 24 hours in Wausau and what we've learned. And the connection is going to be exactly the first general point, and then I'm going to have some specifics, is following immediately from what Deb was saying about the power of naming, that you make things more real by naming them. Deb mentioned, of course, the great novelist from this part of the country, Laura Ingalls Wilder. I'm thinking of another novelist from just about 200 miles west of here, Sinclair Lewis, who's, of course, from Minnesota. And his 100 years ago, he published his book, Babbitt, which was making fun of what he called boosterism in Zenith City, Minnesota, and so trying to mock the idea that people could talk themselves out of their problems. And I think that is something that is in, people recognize the excesses of Babbitry, but giving things names and making them real by doing so is tremendously powerful. And I think a general impression that Deb and I have had in the past months when we've been reading about the plans, the master plans you all have drawn up here with the Chamber of Commerce's leadership, and the videos like the series that is going to be shown over the next couple of weeks, they are, in an important way, creating reality by naming it, saying this is what our community is going to be. And if people have that in mind, it's like people have an idea of what the American story is. And you know that the U.S. in reality falls short of that, but knowing what the story is, knowing what the dream is, it has more power than if there isn't that naming. And a very strong general impression we've had over the past few months, and again these past 24 hours, is the valuable effort that this community and this region is putting into naming its ambitions, naming its hopes, and therefore making it easier for people to say, yes, that's where we are, what we are working for. And naming a great small town, the greatest small town. You can take this to two extremes and have Sinclair Lewis rolling his eyes, but the naming is very powerful, and we've seen that around the country. Now, 5 brief, specific points about things we've noticed in the past 24 hours. One is we've been really newly struck by how blessed this community is, not so much with a natural resource, which I'll get to in a moment, but by a created cultural resource of the locally conscious philanthropy, which really is unusual in this community and is something worth recognizing as an asset that has made the community what it is and will be an important part of making it something more and better in the future. I'll give you 2 examples that we have in mind when we're thinking about the kinds of local community foundations, local trusts, the ways that people who've made their fortunes in Wausau, or even modest fortunes have decided to invest it here. One comparison worth bearing in mind is that between Detroit and Pittsburgh. Detroit and Pittsburgh in the middle of the last century had comparable job losses. Detroit with the auto industry, Pittsburgh with steel. Pittsburgh lost about half its population when the steel industry went away. Detroit lost even more. But Pittsburgh is now obviously on much stronger footing than Detroit, and it's not just because of its universities, which have been so important in its tech renovation, but because Pittsburgh had the Carnegie fortune and the Mellon fortune and the Fricks and others that had endowed Pittsburgh-specific facilities, for parks and museums and opera houses and all the rest. And Detroit, despite the great fortunes that were made there, didn't have that same kind of locally conscious philanthropy. I think that Wausau is more on the Pittsburgh side of that divide than the Detroit side, and that is worth recognizing. Another example, again, to bear in mind and naming what you have, this may seem strained, but think of the town of Bentonville, Arkansas. Now, Bentonville, Arkansas has something you do not, which is the world headquarters of the Walmart Corporation, and having, just tens of thousands of new jobs because of that. But it also has extremely locally conscious philanthropy by the younger generations of the Walton family. People who are now in their 30s or early 40s who have decided that Bentonville is going to be a great place to live, the place that they would like to live and not New York or San Francisco or Paris, and a place where they'd like to have all sorts of activities. So I think the first thing we know now we didn't know 24 hours ago, we're newly impressed by, is the importance of the endowment in all senses that you all have here. It's worth naming that, recognizing it, using it, and recognizing it as a strength of this community. The second thing that has struck us, again, we knew in theory, but it's all the more vivid to see it in person, is the natural endowment you have around here, as Deb was mentioning, and the way this opens an avenue to a real identity and possibility for this community. They're not making any more mountains, or at least not very quickly. They're not making any more forests. They're not making any more rivers. And the situation that you all have by nature around here is identical to that of places that have made themselves renowned centers of outdoor activities, outdoor recreation. In our movie, we have a whole segment on Bend, Oregon, which is now thought of as something like Aspen or some kind of island of privilege. But 30 years ago, it was really a bankrupt sawmill town, and they willed themselves into the identity as an outdoor sports mecca, as some other places have done too. The state of Vermont has had a project. Maui has always had certain things going for it, but the Ironman competition, had some effect on Maui before, of course, its latest disaster. The city of Duluth, where I've spent a lot of time over the decades, 20 or 30 years ago, again, you would think of it as a post-industrial distressed city. It made itself a recreation center. We know that this is part of your ambition and your plan, but this seems really, you should go for it. You should think of this place as the next great, outdoor recreation center of this part of the country and of the country. So if anybody sees what you have here, they say, yes, of course, that is an important asset for you and a really legitimate ambition. If Bend can do it, if Bentonville can do it, you can do it despite not having Walmart here. I'll use one other regional comparison on this point. Deb mentioned she grew up on the shores of Lake Erie. Lake Erie in the popular press over the last couple of decades has had bad press. The lake was on fire, et cetera, et cetera. Auto plants were closing down. Now, some really ambitious young leaders in the cities of Sandusky and Toledo in particular are naming their area as America's next coast. That as climate change makes the southern part of the country hotter, the Great Lakes is America's next great coast. And they are trying to do what I think you all have a head start in doing, of using your natural resources. The third thing that struck us is reinforcing a point we made in our book and believe all the more strongly that actual downtowns really matter. And it is worth pouring resources into actual downtowns like the one you have on 3rd Street and the one where we are right at this moment in the 400 block. And I mention that because I know it's controversial here, the fate of the mall. I can tell you there are lots of cities around the country that would love to be in your position of having already moved past the mall to something new. My hometown of Redlands, California, which I love, is blighted by this horrific mall that went in the mid-1960s, knocking down a lot of old architecture, and now is entirely vacant. And it's been vacant for a dozen years, and the middle of the town is sort of occupied by a dead mall. Charleston, West Virginia is in the same situation. So they would look to you as saying, you are now in the next stage of finding ways to bring people downtown, new businesses, et cetera, having kids museums and all the rest. So Sioux Falls, South Dakota has the same wish. Allentown, Pennsylvania has the same wish. So you should view yourselves as sort of leading the curve of finding a way to move past a 1970s or idea of, even though the malls worked in those days, to what will come next. So downtowns really matter, and we respect what you're doing, what you've already done to have all these anchor institutions here. So that's my third point. The fourth point, which we've gathered from talks with lots of young people around here and some older people too, is the tenacity of place identity. If you ask people why they're here, well, it's where I'm from. Now, I worked in the Twin Cities for a while. I worked in Miami. I worked in San Francisco. But this is where I'm from, and this is where I'd like to be and like to have my children. And recognizing that it's good for people from here young people to go out and see the world, but there is that hook in people's minds of where they are from, where they feel they should be, where the landscape looks the way they want, where they feel connections to people. And so if, as Deb was saying, you can both emphasize the people who might want to come back at some time and make it attractive, and then all these sort of incidental ways you can get new people. Which brings me to my final point, which is the importance and the challenge of bringing in new people. Our kids, whose children you now know about, they were both in high school and college. They both were rowers, on crew teams. And one of their coaches in college, who was later a U.S. Olympic coach, said a motto which has become a watchword in our household, which is, you're either getting faster or you're getting slower. And it was his motto for every day's practice out on the river. You're either getting faster or you're getting slower. And there's something similar with cities. They're either sort of moving ahead or they're falling behind. And the only way you move ahead is by having new people come, because shocking as it is for me to recognize, people do get older and they're not going to be there forever and ever. And while bringing in new people by definition is always disruptive in various ways, at its extreme, like in Bend, it means crisis of housing prices, and it always through American history means disruption of different kinds of people with different cultures from different places. But the alternative of not attracting them is worse in the long run. And so we have been so struck by examples around the country of places you wouldn't expect making themselves intentionally sort of magnets from people around the world. I'll just mention two examples. One is the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, where many of you have probably been. Erie had a declining industrial base, a declining sort of natural population. 10% of their entire population is refugees now. Not immigrants, but refugees. And I thought, this is the way we're going to have an Erie of the future. Dodge City, Kansas. Some of you may remember the Gunsmoke TV series set in Dodge City, which they still have this kind of Disneyland type downtown. It's traditionally a white-dominated community. It's now majority Latino. And the white leadership of Dodge City has said, this is our future. If we want to have a Dodge City of the future, we have to make it as welcoming to new people as it can possibly be. So just to wrap this up and to give a chance for any response, in every realm, you're either getting faster or you're getting slower. We think you're getting faster. And we think you're getting faster in the right direction. We look forward to learning a lot more and staying in touch over the months and years to come. So thank you so much for letting us see your growing community.
Oh, you can't go anywhere. Can't go anywhere. I'll let you stand over here. You can use that microphone. Thank you. So yesterday they flew into Green Bay, and we had the opportunity to drive that 90-minute between Green Bay and Wausau. And we had a lot of conversations, and one of the things, they ask really good questions, and you can tell they're writers and reporters and say they know how to do the interviews. One of the questions that James asked was, what do you think, Dave, that you're not necessarily doing well at, that you should be doing better? And for me, because of the work we do with business and industry and our partnerships with post-secondary and K-12 education and government, the lack of innovation became the answer that I gave him, meaning we do not have a strategic aspect of how we are helping to foster innovation, to create that next generation of industries. So much like the video that you saw of our community, when you saw those entrepreneurs and Bernie and Bob creating these new products and innovating new companies, we don't have a lot of startup new companies here spinning off. And so could you just share a little bit on your perspective as to the importance of innovation, and something we've talked about numerous times since you've been here, is the role of post-secondary education in that?
Yeah. So on the innovation front, this first video and some of the other ones stress the constant adaptability of people in the Wausau area to various, economic challenges, and the historic shift from, timber to paper to all the other things that have been industries here show that how that has happened. I'm trying to find a specific way. Here's the most specific way I can think of. It's a big change in kind of the job landscape these days, and also the community development landscape these days is not attracting another big factory or even another big warehouse or even another big call center, but having a sort of fertile area for people who have advanced manufacturing ideas. The heritage here is very rich in manufacturing, as we know. And so if you're going to have an advanced manufacturing idea in Northern California, it's a lot harder to do that because, there the landscape is rich with tech startups, but there's not a lot of making actual things there in Northern California, and has not historically been a place where you make actual things. Los Angeles is different. It's been a big garment center, et cetera. There's a really rich heritage here, and the practical skills of making real things and continuing to do it in a higher and higher value way. And I'll use an example now that I've thought of it, of a place that has similar concerns and has had a very creative way of dealing with it. That is Louisville in Kentucky and its surrounding areas, and just across the river in Ohio. Louisville, which I hadn't realized until we went there, is where GE had made traditionally its kitchen appliances. Washers and fridges and things like that came out of the Louisville area. And GE sold that business to the Chinese company Haier 15 years ago or so. And the area of Louisville was thinking, how can we employ people who have this manufacturing heritage and are good with their hands? And there's a really impressive public-private business academic partnership in Louisville, where the universities there, the companies, including this Chinese one, are finding ways to have little workshops for people who are good with their hands and technical training. So they have places to start new companies, and there's been a lot of them that have come out of there. And so I think where there's a place with this technical heritage, as this part of Wisconsin has, a partnership with technical universities, with the University of Wisconsin system, with businesses, finding ways to deliberately foster that. This is a long and rambling way to say it's a hard problem. It's easy to say, yeah, we should be more innovative, but I think and Pittsburgh is the other place I would look for, where you've deliberately fostered manufacturing creativity and it has paid off. And we'll put you in touch with the Louisville people in particular. Deb, do you have any thoughts? Oh, yeah. Greenville, South Carolina, yeah.
So Greenville is one of our favorite towns that we visited. They have BMW, Michelin, and GE
windmills.
GE windmills. It's interesting because you've got these international companies with their headquarters and their operations going on there, and it's especially interesting on how it has blended with the school system in Greenville, that they recognize that they want homegrown STEM sophisticated people to be working in those companies and to be, therefore, as they grow up, innovating in those companies. So they have built a whole gradation, starting with the elementary schools, little bitty kids. A.J. Wittenberg Elementary School of Engineering, pre-K through 4, for these little tiny engineers, kids, who are learning these STEM skills and training. And they have regular tutorials or regular classes by some of the young workers from these tech companies, who are actually these kids' parents, coming in to teach classes on electricity or whatever it is. They've graduated to the middle schools, which are doing the same thing at a much more sophisticated level, and the high schools. So they've got this whole feeder system through the education into the companies. And of course, it has, the added bonus, those kids are going to stay there because they'll be really well trained for those jobs. So.
Can I pile on for a second more? Because now that you've raised this, I'm just thinking of more places. And it's another example of naming something and making it real. That in Allentown, PA, where they had a lot of sort of older industrial, heritage that had been declining, they have deliberately found ways to have partnerships among the universities there, the community colleges, the businesses, to say, okay, we're going to have this innovation zone. It used to be a Mack truck plant, and now we're going to be doing these things in it. In Duluth, again, Duluth, they said, with the presence of Cirrus in particular, we're going to make this a center of aviation innovation. And so naming a place, naming the challenge of putting melding the different interests here in a sort of new project of fostering innovation, that can make it more real.
So in that concept, in the dialogue that we had, a concept that I shared in a snarky way with them is the Wausau Polytechnic Institute. And if I had a t-shirt on, you'd say, where's that, right? And we don't have it. But we have the opportunity to build it conceptually because we have a fantastic technical college. We have a strong K-12 system which feeds the tech and the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point in Wausau. And so those are the types of things that this community, we have the opportunity to build. Now, it might make Stout a little bit mad if we call it Wausau Polytechnic, but you know what? You got to own it, right? You take it and you own it. The other thing that I hadn't heard a bit, so you traveled the country, and you talked about Sioux Falls, immigrant population, migrant population. In your travels, how important is diversity and inclusivity in community growth?
The number of towns where, we've seen a lot of towns where there are 10% of the people are immigrants. I know that you have a huge Hmong population in this town too. And Erie, Pennsylvania, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Burlington, Vermont, Fresno, California, Dodge City, Kansas. The doors have opened, and I would say that there's like a welcome banner outside on the edges of the town, and it is because the residents of the town have grown to feel and appreciate that this is lifting their town. This is making their town have more opening their eyes to other parts of the world that they would not otherwise have. It's not easy because the clash of cultures, the different backgrounds that especially refugees bring to a situation, the stories of kids who've grown up in South Sudan, marching across the country, saving their lives, being separated from their parents, reconnecting, they're all just, but all of those stories and all of those experiences of a town opening itself up to change that will enrich them, that will help them do good in the world, and just contribute to moving forward. It has been, I would say, overall always positive, not perfect by any means, because it's hard. It means you have to change and you have to adapt to everything. But I think it also brings a great sense of pride of look what we have done in this community and how we've helped others and helped ourselves.
So I will venture to tell you what I actually think about something as opposed to just reporting what we've
seeing, Deb and I have lived outside the U.S. for a lot of years. Our honeymoon was on a work camp in Ghana. We lived in England for a number of years. We lived in Japan and Malaysia and China. And the more time we've spent outside the United States, the more passionately I felt that the fundamental American advantage is its ability to make use of an outsized share of the world's talent, that we can make people feel as if this is the place where they can realize their ambitions. Through American history, this has always been disruptive. Every wave of immigrants, the 1880s, it was hugely disruptive. 1850s, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's always been disruptive, but I would argue this has been the distinctive magic that the United States has, that no other country that is as open is as big. Canada and Australia are relatively more open, but they're smaller. No other country that is as big is as open. China is a whole different situation. So our impression, I'll give you just one anecdote from Dodge City, Kansas, which I mentioned. We wrote in a number of articles that the mainly white power structure of Dodge City was saying, our future is really this more diverse population. They were doing all kinds of things to have assimilation classes. We read a story before one of the elections, I think it was maybe the 2016 election, saying in the New York Times that Dodge City had moved its only polling place way out of town, away from its Latino population. So we called up our friends in Dodge City and said, what the hell? This is not what you've been telling us. And they said this was the state, some machinations from the state level Kansas people who were trying to do this. And so what the city government of Dodge City did was the next day, the mainly white city council passed a resolution saying, we will provide transportation for any legal voter in Dodge City to this new polling place. And they put out that announcement in English and Spanish. And that was the kind of willed effort to name a diverse future and to get there. So,
thank you. So we're coming up to our hour of conclusion. I'm going to get one question. Is there anybody out there who has a burning question that they would like to ask James and Deborah?
I have a question for your audience.
Go ahead.
Okay. So one thing we accidentally discovered when we were going around the country was what we call the second question. The first question, if you're in a group like this, maybe you all know each other, but if this theater were filled, you wouldn't know everyone in town. So the first question, hello, how are you? But if you're at some kind of gathering like this, the second question is the interesting question that is always a tell about the town. In St. Louis, the second question is always, where'd you go to high school? Because it tells you so much about the culture of where you grew up and what your experience has been. In the South, in Greenville, in Georgia, where do you go to church? If you tell somebody where you go to church, that tells you a lot about their politics, about their social sense, and so forth. In Washington, D.C., who do you work for? That puts you on the pecking order of things. In L.A., how'd you get here? Well, I took the 10 to the 405, and then, and after that, well, where'd you park? That's the obsession. In a kind of twist on the, who do you work for, what do you do question, which is so obnoxious, is when you ask somebody the question, what do you do in Burlington, Vermont? It doesn't mean, what do you do for a living? It means, well, I ski, or I go out on my boat, or I do snowshoeing. That's the what do you do question. So my question to you is, what is your second question in this town? Is there a second question you would all agree on, or not?
And you're asking me.
I'm asking it. Anyone.
Anybody out there want?
But I'm asking you, Dave.
Casey, did you have your hand up?
Did you grow up here?
Did you go to Wausau East or Wausau West?
Yeah.
I told them about the river, how deep it runs here in Wausau.
Okay, that's unique. Never heard that one before. What's your favorite cheese curd? Yeah. What's the Alaska? Yeah. The question you don't ask in Alaska is, where are you from? Because there's a great witness protection program there. And so you don't pry, right?
All right. James and Deborah, thank you very much.
Thank you all for having us here.
So I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank all of you for being here. Young ladies, you're not going to have to cook for a while, okay? We've got some food for you, and we're going to set it home so you can feed your brother, okay? So don't leave without it. I want to thank my team. The work we do as an organization for our membership, for our community. I love this team. And I told my wife I'm not going to get emotional tonight. I'm going to keep to that. Sue Wolcott, she's a finance director. Sharon Bauman, special projects. Brian Otten, communications marketing director. Kathy Peterson. Kathy's not here tonight. Kathy broke her foot, so she's at home and laying off of it, and she's our membership sales. Lucas Lindner over there. Lucas is the advocacy and workforce staff. Susan Crollo. So Susan is new on our team. She's the programs and events director. She is the one who, this is her fledgling event in the chamber. And Susan, where are you? I think you were back there someplace. There you are. Susan, you did a fantastic job. The food, the venue, I want to thank you very much. You hit a home run right out of the gate. Thank you. Another group. So the chamber, we spun off our foundation, and it's the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partnership, which is an economic development leadership group. I want to thank Matt Rowe. Matt Rowe is the chair. Chris Cadorzi is on the executive committee. Chad Kane is on the executive committee. Scott Katnow, Scott's here. I want to thank those business leaders that are on the executive committee, and there's other corporate leaders, but it's those people that are helping to move that partnership forward. But I do want to express my deepest, sincerest appreciation for Renee Krings. Renee Krings has been with our organization and affiliation for 7 years. She's not here tonight. She's kids soccer, family first. That's our culture at the chamber, family first. So Renee has been with the organization 7 years, but she spun off, and she's the senior director of the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partnership, and she's now helping to take that leadership forward. Big successes. Just yesterday, 3 years worth of work to engage the Wisconsin DNR. In fact, Bill Bertram and I were down in Madison 4 years ago. And the process by which they went through to create a new master plan for Granite Peak, Rib Mountain State Park. That's a future of transformation for this community. It's going to be a game changer. It fits in with outdoor recreation. That does not happen without the business leaders and citizens and people who got on a bus, drove down to Madison, and talked for 90 minutes in support of it. And so we got it yesterday, and it's time for the next steps. So, had to make sure I thank everybody. You know, the thing that, and all of you know this too, the things that we do in this community, it takes all of us. It takes all of us. And you must have appreciation for the love and passion and the hard work when people roll up their sleeves to get it done here in our town, Wausau. And I just want to thank you all for being here. Again, thank you to our sponsors, and keep an eye out for the next videos. It gets better, okay? So with that, thank you very much. Have a great evening.